Hello! So this is my last vlog for my American poetry class, and as it's coming to an end, we are wrapping up kind of talking about Arizonan poets, and specifically we were asked this week to focus on one collection of poetry that we've read throughout the course, and of course I chose Natalie Diaz. We read her book When My Brother Was an Aztec, which is a very, very intense collection of poems, and it deals with a lot of really intense subjects and themes and things like that, so it was really easy for me to pick her as my focus for this final week. I had heard some of Diaz's poems read. My fiction professor actually read them to us last semester when I took fiction writing, and I was just struck by how intense they were. For those of you who don't know, Natalie Diaz is an Arizonan-based poet. She's both Native American and Hispanic, so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy that she has going on within herself, but that also comes out really well in her poetry because she kind of combines both the background of her Hispanic side and her Native American side. So it's a very interesting dichotomy because a lot of these themes can be applied to both cultures separately and together. So that's one of the things I found most interesting about Diaz's poetry. So Natalie Diaz is obviously a modern poet. She's 20th, 21st century, but a lot of her things deal with historical happenings such as like Trail of Tears and the reservation. A lot of cultural stereotyping and things like that, which were still very prominent in history, but they're even more prominent now. Personally, I've reported on stuff like this. I wrote a story called Here and There, which dealt with issues that are problems on the reservation that are still affecting the way people live there and the way they deal with the society as a whole. So I will link that downstairs. This is not shameless self-promotion at all, but yes, check that out if you're interested. But a lot of the things I discuss in that piece are also things that Diaz discusses in her poetry. So it's kind of it was cool for me to see these things that I've researched being talked about in this artistic manner. And I think that background helped me a lot and is really why I identified it a little bit more with Diaz and her poetry, just because I have a little bit more background on what's going on. So looking back through what we've already talked about through this whole semester, it's kind of crazy to go from Song of Myself with Walt Whitman to When My Brother Was an Aztec and Natalie Diaz. It's a very big jump if you're just looking at those two, but since we've gone through it somewhat gradually, even though it was very intense and very quick, the way it was gradually made it make sense on what styles Diaz is using and what techniques she's using in her poetry and her writing. So there are a lot of modernism themes that she uses, namely I found that she uses a lot of naturalism and nature-based themes, which I will talk about in my Tumblr post. There's a link below, so go check that out to read a little bit more about my thought process. But she is very much a modernist poet, so she deals with imagery and naturalism and things like that. Her imagery is insane, and I think that's where she kind of mimics a lot of the mid-century schools of poetry that we've talked about before, namely the confessional poets who use a lot of imagery to talk about deep emotion and really make the poem much more intense and much more shocking for the reader to kind of grab them and say, this is happening, pay attention to it. So I think Diaz uses that really well. Another thing that I will talk about in my Tumblr post is how American poetry is very much social activism in a way. So a lot of poets, especially American poets, are using their poetry as a way to get their message out there or a way to vocalize their frustration or their thoughts on certain things. So in a lot of Black arts poetry we see this with the poem I read from Jean Toomer. That poem's very much a way to shock people into realizing what's actually happening in their society, and a lot of Diaz's poetry really does this as well, especially with Native American issues. I got a lot of feedback from my piece that I wrote just because people didn't know it was happening. So that's why it's really important that Diaz is a poet and she's writing about these things, because a lot of them are just not being talked about. So it's important that not only for herself and her own personal development, but also for other people reading it to see, yes, these things are happening and you should pay attention to them. So this week we are actually going to be reading a couple poems here on this vlog. We are supposed to choose 2 to 3 poems to discuss in our posts on Tumblr. In my posts I talk about the different schools that kind of exist within Natalie Diaz's poetry, and namely with imagery, I really liked her poem, The Gospel of Guy No Horse, so I'll be reading that one. It has some really intense imagery, and it really drops you into this scene of this kind of janky dive bar with these really uncomfortable characters and this really uncomfortable scene, but the way she uses the imagery is just genius, so here we go. At the engine that could, a jalopy bar drooping and lopsided on the bank of the Colorado River, a once mighty red body now dammed and tamed blue. Guy No Horse was glistening drunk and dancing fancy with 2 white gals, both yellow-haired tourists still in bikini tops, freckled skins blistered pink by the savage Mojave Desert sun. Though the engine, as it was known by locals, had no true dance floor, truce meant little on such a night. Card tables covered in drink, ash, and melting ice had been pushed aside, shoved together to make a place for the rhythms that came easy to people in the coyote hours beyond midnight. In the midst of camel smoke hanging lower and thicker than a September monsoon, No Horse rode high, his PIMC-issued wheelchair transfigured, a magical chariot drawn by 2 blonde, beer-clumsy palominos perfumed with coconut sunscreen and $1.50 Budweisers. He was as careful as any man could be at almost 2 a.m. to avoid their sunburned toes. In the brown light of the engine, chips in their toenail polish glinted like diamonds. Other Indians noticed the awkward trinity and gathered round in a dented circle, clapping, whooping, slinging obscenities from their tongues of fire. Yaha! Yaha! Jeering their dark horse, No Horse, toward the finish line of an obviously rigged race. No Horse didn't hear their rabble, which was soon overpowered as the 2-man band behind the bar really got after it, a jam probably about love, but maybe about freedom, and definitely about him, as his fair-haired tandem, his denim-skirted pendulums kept time, the time being now. No Horse sucked his lips, imagined the taste of the white girl's thrusting hips. Hey, he sang. Hey, he smiled. Hey, he spun around in the middle of a crowd of his fellow tribesmen, a sparkling centurion moving as fluid as an Indian could be at almost 2 in the morning, rolling back, forth, popping wheelies that tipped his big head and swung his braids like shiny lassos of lust. The 2 white gals looked down at him, looked back up at each other, raised their plastic solo cups runneth over, laughing loudly, hysterical at the very thought of dancing with a broken-down Indian. But about that laughter, No Horse didn't give a damn. This was an edge of res where warriors were made on nights like these, with music like this, and tonight he was out, dancing at the engine that could. If you'd seen the lightning of his smile, not the empty space leaking from his thighs, you might have believed that man was walking on water, or at least that he had legs again. And as for the white girls slurring around him like 2 bedraggled angels, one holding onto the handle of his wheelchair, the other spilling her drink all down the front of her shirt, well, for them, he was sorry, because this was not a John Wayne movie. This was the engine that could, and the only cavalry riding this night was in No Horse's veins. Hey, 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 he hollered. So I'll talk more about this poem in my actual post, but just be paying attention to how much description Diaz gets into these tight little packages of verse. She also has kind of perfected this thing that I noticed with the confessional and the deep image poets, which is there's really no concern for brevity. I mean, she doesn't want to pack so much into just like one line. She really takes her time to develop a scene, but she's also very very strategic in the way she develops her imagery. It's very fast the way it moves, but it's not rushed.